Your chest tightens for no apparent reason. Your mind won't stop generating scenarios that haven't happened. Your body is here, but your awareness is living 3 weeks ahead, anticipating catastrophes that will probably never occur. And when you try to explain what has you like this, you can't find precise words. You only know that something inside you is constantly alert, constantly preparing for a danger you can't name. You call it anxiety. And you believe it comes from the uncertain future ahead of you. You believe it's your mind trying to protect you from what could go wrong. You believe that if you could just control more variables, plan more scenarios, prepare for more contingencies, then you would finally be calm. But that is exactly what is generating your anxiety. Not the future, but what you are doing right now with the future in your mind. Anxiety is not a problem you have. It is a symptom of how you are using your mind. And the Stoics understood this 2,000 years ago with a clarity that modern psychology is only beginning to recover. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of the known world, with responsibilities that literally determined the fate of millions of people, wrote something that should confront you directly. Today, I escaped anxiety. Or no, I discarded it. Because it was within me, in my own perceptions, not outside. Read that again. The anxiety was not in the impossible circumstances he faced. It was in how his mind processed those circumstances. And when he changed the way he processed them, the anxiety disappeared, not because the circumstances improved, but because he stopped relating to them in the way that generates anxiety. You have probably tried everything superficial, breathing techniques that work for 3 minutes, guided meditations that calm you temporarily, positive affirmations that sound good but change nothing, and they all lead back to the same place, trying to manage symptoms while ignoring the cause. It's like taking painkillers for a toothache without ever going to the dentist. The relief is temporary because the root problem remains untouched. The Stoics do not offer you techniques to manage anxiety. They offer something deeper and more uncomfortable, an understanding of why your mind generates it in the first place. And that understanding is the only thing that truly transforms. Because when you clearly see how you produce your own anxiety through specific mental patterns, you can stop producing it, not suppress it, not manage it. Simply stop generating it. Epictetus, who lived as a slave in one of the most anxiety-provoking situations imaginable, taught something radical. People are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them. It is not your circumstances that generate your anxiety. It is how you think about your circumstances. The distinction seems subtle, but it is absolutely transformative. Because if your circumstances generate your anxiety, you are completely powerless. You can only wait for circumstances to improve. But if the way you think about your circumstances generates your anxiety, you have absolute power. You can change the way you think, and that change does not require the world to be different. It only requires you to process the world differently. Seneca spent years watching the most powerful people in Rome be consumed by anxiety, despite having all the external control imaginable. And he wrote something that exposes the fundamental lie behind anxiety. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Think about the last week. How many hours did you spend anxious about things that never happened? How many catastrophic scenarios did you play out in your mind that revealed themselves as fantasy when the real moment arrived? How much emotional energy did you consume on futures that never materialized? The honest answer is probably almost all of it, because that is what anxiety does. It makes you suffer 1,000 times in imagination, events that may happen once in reality, or never at all. And every time your mind plays out those scenarios, your body reacts as if they were real. Your heart races, your breath shortens, your muscles tense, not because something is happening, but because your mind is convinced that something is about to happen. You live in a permanent state of emergency for threats that exist only in your head, and that is not anxiety about the future. It is anxiety generated now, by you, through the way you think. I lived this for years, not necessarily with clinically diagnosed anxiety, but with that constant background noise that never fully turns off. That sense that something is wrong, even when, objectively, everything is fine. That inability to simply be still without the mind immediately jumping to what you should be doing, what could go wrong, what you need to prepare. And I tried everything modern culture offers. More productivity to feel control, more planning to reduce uncertainty, more optimization to eliminate variables. But every strategy only fed the problem, because all of them assumed anxiety came from outside and needed to be managed through external control. None showed me that I was generating anxiety through specific mental patterns that I could change, until I found the Stoics. And what I discovered were not techniques to manage anxiety better. They were brutally honest reasons for why I was generating it. 10 specific mental patterns that, once I saw them clearly, completely lost their power over me. Not because I suppressed them, but because I understood how they worked. And that understanding was liberating in a way no breathing technique ever was. Marcus Aurelius did not manage his anxiety. He dismantled it at the root. Epictetus did not cope with constant worry. He cut the mental patterns that produced it. Seneca did not need to calm himself repeatedly. He had eliminated the causes of his agitation, and you have access to that same process. It does not require different circumstances. It does not require fewer responsibilities. It does not require a safer future. It requires seeing with brutal honesty the 10 mental patterns that are generating your anxiety right now. Because anxiety does not come from an uncertain future. It comes from how you are processing that future in your present mind. And when you change the processing, the anxiety disappears, even if the future remains uncertain. There are 10 specific Stoic reasons why you suffer from anxiety. 10 mental patterns that, if you operate under them, guarantee that you will live in a constant anxious state. Not because the world is anxious, but because your way of thinking about the world inevitably generates anxiety. These 10 reasons are not comfortable. They will not tell you that everything will be fine, or that you just need to relax more. They will show you exactly how you are building your own anxiety, one mental decision at a time. And that revelation is uncomfortable because it removes the convenient excuse that the world makes me anxious. No, you make yourself anxious through the way you relate to the world. But that same revelation is liberating. Because if you generate your anxiety, you can stop generating it. Not eventually. Not when circumstances improve. Now, before we continue, before we explore the 10 reasons that will transform your relationship with anxiety, you need to do more than listen passively. You need to declare a specific commitment. Not a private thought you forget the next time anxiety returns tomorrow. Not a vague intention that dissolves when your mind falls back into its automatic patterns, a public declaration that creates real accountability. Go to the comments right now and write exactly this. My anxiety does not come from outside. From today on, I observe how I generate it from within. Those words are not just a motivational phrase. They are your acknowledgement that you have seen an uncomfortable truth, that you have been generating your own anxiety through mental patterns you had never examined, and that you have decided that clarity about those patterns matters more than the comfort of blaming external circumstances. Do it now. Pause this audio. Go to the comments. Write, my anxiety does not come from outside. From today on, I observe how I generate it from within. That act of public declaration makes your commitment real in a way private thought never does. The Stoics understood the power of public vows. They knew that when you declare your intention externally, when you make it visible to others, you create a force that dramatically increases your ability to sustain it. Because it is no longer just a promise to yourself that you can quietly break when anxiety returns. It is a commitment others have seen. And that visibility creates accountability that turns intention into practice. What follows are the 10 Stoic reasons why you suffer from anxiety, reasons no one trapped in constant rumination wants to hear, but that anyone who wants mental freedom desperately needs. Each reason is a key that unlocks a specific way you produce your own anxiety. Each reason exposes the exact mechanism through which your mind turns neutral circumstances into imagined threats. And each reason will give you clarity on how to stop operating under that pattern. It will not be comfortable. The truth about how you generate your anxiety never is. It will not be easy. Changing mental patterns built over years requires constant vigilance, but it is absolutely necessary if you want to live without that constant background noise that has consumed your mental energy for far too long. This is your moment. Not next week when you have less stress. Not next month when circumstances are calmer. Not when you finally have everything under control. This, now, with the anxiety you feel in this moment, with the mental patterns operating right now, with the mind you have today, with the resistance you are feeling at this exact instant, that little voice saying, my anxiety really does come from my difficult circumstances. My situation is different. This won't apply to me. That voice is exactly the pattern you need to observe, because freedom from anxiety begins when you stop defending the patterns that create it. And that moment is now. First Stoic reason. You try to control what was never under your control. Anxiety does not come from an uncertain future. It comes from trying to force certainty where only uncertainty exists. And the more you try to control the uncontrollable, the more anxiety you create. Epictetus taught something that is the foundation of all Stoic thinking on anxiety. There are things that are up to us, and things that are not up to us. Up to us are our opinions, motivations, desires, and aversions. In short, everything that is our own action. Not up to us are our body, property, reputation, status. In short, everything that is not our own action. Read that again. Slowly. Because you probably spend 90% of your mental energy trying to control things that belong to the second category. You try to control what others think of you. That creates constant social anxiety. You try to control whether you will get that promotion. That creates anxiety about your worth. You try to control whether your partner will love you forever. That creates relationship anxiety. You try to control whether your health will ever fail. That creates anxiety over every symptom. You try to control whether the future will be safe. That creates anxiety about events that have not happened. And every one of these attempts at control is like trying to stop the rain with your hands. It does not work. And it leaves you exhausted and soaked while the rain continues, indifferent to your effort. Your anxiety is the exhaustion that comes from trying to control variables that were never under your control. Marcus Aurelius understood this perfectly as emperor. He had more power than almost any human in history. He could decree laws, command armies, decide fates, and yet he wrote constantly about how little he actually controlled. You have power over your mind, not over external events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Not try harder to control external events. Not work more, so everything turns out the way you want. But recognize that you do not control external events. You only control your mind. And in that recognition, not in the effort to control, you find peace. The reason you suffer constant anxiety is devastatingly simple. You have misclassified what is under your control. You believe you can control outcomes when you can only control actions. You believe you can control how you are perceived when you can only control how you behave. You believe you can control whether you will succeed when you can only control your effort. And every time you misclassify, every time you try to control the uncontrollable, your mind enters a state of alert, because you are asking it to do something impossible. And when the mind enters that state of, I need to control this, but I can't, that is literally the definition of anxiety. Seneca observed this constantly in Rome. People with immense power consumed by anxiety because they tried to control more than power allows. We want to dictate to fate instead of accepting what it gives us. And that struggle against the inevitable is the source of all unnecessary suffering. Every time you think, I need this to turn out a specific way, you create anxiety. Because you have taken something outside your control and turned it into a necessity. Now your mental well-being depends on something you cannot guarantee. That is the perfect recipe for perpetual anxiety. The Stoic practice that cuts this root of anxiety is brutally simple, but it requires absolute honesty. Every time you feel anxiety rising, ask yourself immediately, what am I trying to control right now? Not, why do I feel anxious? That keeps you stuck in the symptom. But what am I trying to control? Then ask the second critical question, is this truly under my control, or do I just wish it were? The honest answer in 90% of cases is, it is not under your control. You are trying to control the outcome, other people's behavior, the future, perception, complex variables with 1,000 factors you do not control. And when you honestly recognize, this is not under my control, something extraordinary happens. Anxiety has nothing to hold on to, because anxiety needs the illusion that you could control it if you just tried harder, worried more, planned more. But when you recognize that it is not under your control, no matter how much effort you apply, you can let go. Not defeated resignation, but the liberating recognition of reality. Marcus Aurelius practiced this before every important decision. He asked himself, what is under my control here? The answer was always smaller than his ego wanted to admit. He could control his decision, his preparation, his execution. He could not control the outcome. Other people's responses, unpredictable consequences. So he focused 100% of his mental energy on what he controlled, and zero energy on what he did not. That practice did not just eliminate unnecessary anxiety, it made his actions more effective, because he acted from clarity instead of anxiety. Epictetus taught his students an exercise that still works perfectly today. When you are about to meet someone, remember that you do not control what they will say, how they will react, or what they will think of you. You only control your behavior. So prepare your behavior and release everything else. Imagine living like this. You go to a job interview. You do not control whether you will be hired. You only control how you present yourself. You have a difficult conversation with your partner. You do not control their reaction. You only control what you say and how you say it. You submit an important project. You do not control how it will be received. You only control the quality you deliver. In every situation, anxiety disappears from 90% of the variables. Because you release 90% of the variables you never controlled anyway. And you focus completely on the 10% you actually control. That does not just remove anxiety. It allows the 10% under your control to be executed with excellence. Because your mind is no longer fragmented across 1,000 worries about the uncontrollable. It is fully present with the only thing that matters: what you can actually do. The brutal truth you must confront is that you have probably spent years of mental energy trying to control things that were never under your control. And every moment of that effort generated anxiety. Not because the world is anxious, but because you were trying to do the impossible. Seneca ended one of his texts on anxiety with a devastating question. Why do you spend your life worrying about things you cannot change while neglecting the things you can change? That question applies now. How much mental energy did you spend this week trying to control the uncontrollable? How much anxiety did you generate trying to guarantee outcomes that did not depend on you? And meanwhile, how much of what you do control was neglected because you were mentally absent, worrying about what you do not control? In the end, the first reason for your anxiety is simple. You try to control what was never under your control. And as long as you keep trying, you will remain anxious. Not because the future is uncertain, but because you are fighting the fundamental reality that most things are outside your control. And that fight is exhausting, futile, and anxiety-producing. The Stoic alternative is not giving up. It is placing absolute focus on what you do control and fully releasing what you do not. That shift in focus is exactly what transforms anxiety into effective action. Second, Stoic reason. You live in the future, you imagine. Instead of the present, you have. Your anxiety does not come from what is happening. It comes from what you believe will happen. And the difference between those two is absolute. Right now, at this precise moment while you are listening to this, there is probably no real emergency. You are not in immediate physical danger. There is no crisis happening now. The basic things you need to survive are present, but your mind is not here. It is 3 days ahead, imagining the difficult meeting. It is 2 weeks ahead, anticipating the uncomfortable conversation. It is 6 months ahead, worrying about your financial future. And while your mind lives in those imagined futures, your body reacts as if those futures were real and present. Your heart races over a conversation you have not had. Your muscles tense over an event that has not happened. Your breathing tightens over a problem that does not yet exist. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that exposes this madness perfectly. Confine yourself to the present. If you can confine yourself to the present, there is no room for anxiety. Not the present is comfortable and therefore calming, but this. When you are truly in the present, anxiety literally cannot exist, because anxiety requires projection into the future. It requires your mind to rehearse scenarios that have not happened, anticipate problems that do not exist, and prepare for threats that are imaginary. Without that projection into the future, without mentally living ahead of time, anxiety has no fuel. Seneca observed this with devastating precision. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Those tormented by the anticipation of pain suffer what they may never suffer at all. Think about the last time you were truly anxious. Was something terrible happening in that exact moment? Probably not. You were imagining something terrible that might happen, and your mind does not distinguish between vivid imagination and present reality. So you reacted to imagination as if it were real. You suffered for something that was not happening. And if that thing eventually happened, you suffered twice, once in imagination and once in reality. If it never happened, you suffered completely for nothing. The brutal trap is that your mind justifies this constant projection into the future as preparation. I need to think about what could go wrong so I'll be prepared. I need to anticipate problems so I can handle them. I need to worry about the future to be ready. But this is complete self-deception. Preparation is present action that increases your ability to handle possible futures. Anxiety is present rumination that only makes you suffer imagined futures. The first is productive. The second is completely useless. Epictetus made a critical distinction that most people ignore. There is a difference between planning wisely for the future and worrying anxiously about the future. The first uses the present to prepare. The second wastes the present in suffering. When you plan, you are in the present, taking actions that improve your future capacity. When you worry, you are in an imagined future, suffering over situations you do not control. The first empowers you, the second paralyzes you, and most people confuse the two completely. They believe they are planning when they are actually ruminating. They believe they are preparing when they are actually suffering in advance. Your mind has developed the habit of living perpetually ahead of time. It is never truly here. It is always in the next moment, the next task, the next scenario, and that habit creates constant anxiety because the future is inherently uncertain. No matter how much you plan, anticipate, or worry, the future will remain uncertain. So your mind generates more scenarios, more contingencies, more worries, in an impossible attempt to make certain what is fundamentally uncertain. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific to break this pattern. Whenever he noticed his mind projecting anxiously into the future, he asked himself, "Is there anything I need to do about this right now?" If the answer was yes, he took that action immediately, and his mind returned to the present. If the answer was no, he recognized that any further worry was completely useless and consciously brought his attention back to the present moment. That simple practice cut anxiety at its root, because it turned an uncertain future into a manageable present, or it revealed that there was nothing to do now, and therefore no reason to be mentally absent worrying. The practice that turns this from concept into reality is uncomfortable because it exposes how often you are mentally absent. For one full day, every time you notice anxiety, ask yourself immediately, am I in the present or in an imagined future? The honest answer will almost always be an imagined future. Your body is here, but your mind is ahead, replaying scenarios that have not happened. Then ask the second critical question: is the future I am imagining happening right now? The answer is always no. By definition, it is not happening now. It is imaginary. At that point, you have absolute clarity. You are generating anxiety about something that does not exist in this moment. Not that it might exist later. Not that it will probably happen. It does not exist now. And now is the only reality you actually have. Seneca practiced writing about this explicitly. Today I felt anxiety about X. I ask myself, is X happening now? No. Then my anxiety is not about present reality, but about future imagination. That recognition does not eliminate the future or the need to prepare, but it eliminates the unnecessary suffering of living mentally inside that future. You can prepare in the present for possible futures without living anxiously inside imagined ones. Epictetus taught his students something radical. When you project yourself into the future, ask, can I do something about this now? If yes, do it and return to the present. If no, recognize that worrying is completely useless and return to the present. That practice does not just reduce anxiety. It makes your life more effective because all your energy is invested in present action instead of future worry. The brutal truth is that you have probably lived entire years without ever being truly present. Your body has been here, but your mind has lived perpetually ahead, anticipating, worrying, imagining problems. And while you lived mentally in uncertain futures, the real present passed by unlived. Marcus Aurelius summarized this perfectly. Do not be distracted, do not let your mind wander. Stay focused on what is in front of you now. Not because the future does not matter, but because the future is handled through a well-lived present, not through anxiety about imagined futures. In the end, the second reason for your anxiety is clear. You live perpetually in imagined futures instead of in the real present. And as long as your mind remains absent, you will live anxiously over things that do not exist, while losing the only life that does exist, the one happening now. Third Stoic reason: you confuse preferences with absolute needs. Your anxiety multiplies every time you turn a preference into a necessity, and you probably do this dozens of times a day without noticing. I need this meeting to go well. I need them to love me. I need to get that job. I need my children to succeed. Every time you use the word need for something that is actually a preference, you create anxiety. Because you take something that is not fully under your control and turn it into a requirement for your well-being. Epictetus taught something that sounds harsh, but is profoundly liberating. Do not say of anything, I have lost it, but I have given it back. Did your child die? It was given back. Did you lose your property? It was given back. But the one who took it is bad. What concern is it of yours through whom the one who gave it demanded it back? It sounds cold. It sounds merciless. But look at what he is really saying. When you treat something as an absolute necessity, when your well-being depends entirely on keeping it, you live in constant terror of losing it. When you recognize that everything is temporary, that everything is on loan, that preferences are preferences but not necessities, you can enjoy things fully while they are here, and release them without being destroyed when they leave. The difference is not semantic, It is the difference between living with perpetual anxiety and living with deep equanimity. Marcus Aurelius faced this temptation constantly as emperor. He could have treated his power, his position, his family, even his own life as absolute necessities. I need to keep the empire secure. I need my children to survive. I need my legacy to endure. But he wrote specifically to remind himself of reality. Everything is ephemeral, both the one who remembers and what is remembered. Everything is opinion. There are no guarantees. Do not turn preferences into necessities, or you will create your own unnecessary suffering. The trap is that modern culture trains you to turn preferences into necessities. You need to be successful. You need to be loved. You need financial security. You need validation. And every one of these supposed needs generates anxiety, because none of them are fully under your control. Seneca observed this constantly among the wealthiest people in Rome. They had everything anyone could want, yet they lived in constant anxiety because they had turned keeping it all into an absolute necessity. The rich man is not the one who has much, but the one who needs little. Rate, not because having things is bad, but because needing creates anxiety in direct proportion to the need. When you prefer something, you can work toward it without anxiety. If you get it, good. If not, you are still okay. When you need something, every step toward it is charged with desperation, and if you don't get it, your well-being collapses. That distinction completely transforms how you experience life. Epictetus taught his students a specific exercise. Every time you feel anxiety, identify what you believe you need in that situation. Then ask honestly, is this truly a necessity, or is it a preference I have artificially inflated? The honest answer is almost always an inflated preference. You don't need that person to love you. You prefer that they love you. You will survive without it. You don't need that job. You prefer that job. You will find another if you don't get it. You don't need everything to go perfectly. You prefer that it goes well. You will handle imperfection if it happens. Each time you recognize the difference, anxiety loses its grip, because you are no longer operating from, if I don't get this, I collapse. You are operating from, I prefer this, I will work for it, and I will be okay regardless of the outcome. Marcus Aurelius practiced this deliberately before every important decision or event. He asked himself, what outcome do I prefer? Have I turned that preference into an artificial necessity? Then he reminded himself consciously, I prefer X. I will do my best, but I do not need X to be okay. I will be okay with any outcome because my well-being does not depend on external results. The Coda de Deux cast, that practice did not make him passive or indifferent. It made him more effective because he acted from clarity rather than desperate anxiety. Seneca wrote something brutally honest about this. The one who fears will suffer from his fear. The one who needs nothing has nothing to fear, not the one who has everything has nothing to fear. That would be false. But the one who needs nothing, the one who has recognized that preferences are not absolute necessities, that person lives without fear because their well-being does not depend on external variables beyond their control. The practice that dismantles this pattern of anxiety is simple, but it requires brutal honesty. For 1 week, every time you feel anxiety, write this sentence: I am anxious because I believe I need. Finish it honestly. Then ask, Is this truly a necessity for my survival and basic well-being, or is it a preference I have inflated? Finally, rewrite it. In reality, I prefer, but I do not need it. I will be okay regardless. That exercise seems simple, but it brutally exposes how many of your needs are preferences in disguise. And every time you recognize a preference as a preference, you free your well-being from depending on getting it. Epictetus warned specifically about the language of necessity. When you say, "I need," you enslave your peace of mind to something external. When you say, "I prefer," you preserve your inner freedom regardless of what happens externally. In the end, the third reason for your anxiety is clear. You have turned dozens of preferences into absolute necessities, and now your mental well-being depends on obtaining things you do not fully control. That dependence is exactly what creates perpetual anxiety. The Stoic alternative is not to want nothing. It is to want fully, work diligently, but never turn preferences into necessities on which your inner peace depends. That distinction is the difference between living anxiously over every outcome and living with full effort and deep equanimity. Fourth Stoic reason. Your identity depends on external approval. Your social anxiety, your anxiety about your worth, your anxiety about whether you are enough. All of it comes from a single source. You have built your identity on the approval of others. And now you live in constant fear of losing that approval. Because if your value depends on what other people think of you, then every interaction becomes a potential threat to your identity. Every negative opinion destroys you. Every rejection invalidates you. Every criticism shakes you to the core. Not because there is something objectively wrong with you, but because you placed your sense of who you are in the hands of other people. Marcus Aurelius faced this constantly as emperor. Millions of people had opinions about him. Some admired him. Others hated him. Many criticized him. If he had based his identity on those opinions, he would have lived in perpetual anxiety. Instead, he wrote something that should completely free you. The opinion of those who praise or blame you thoughtlessly is worth nothing. Your value lies not in their words, but in your actions, according to your principles. If 1:9. Not ignore all opinions. But do not base your identity on external opinions. Your value, who you are, is defined by your actions aligned with your values, not by the shifting perceptions of people who do not even know you fully. Epictetus taught this with brutal clarity. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and ignorant in external matters. Do not wish to appear knowledgeable. For if others think you are someone important, distrust yourself. Why? Because if your identity depends on being seen as important, you will live in constant anxiety trying to maintain that image. You will need to impress constantly. You will need constant validation. You will need every person to see you as significant. And that need enslaves you to external opinions you never control. Seneca observed this among the most successful people in Rome. They possess every form of external success imaginable, yet they live in anxiety because their sense of worth depends on maintaining that success in the eyes of others. Every decision is filtered through what will they think instead of what is right. Every action is motivated by impressing rather than integrity. Every day they are performing a role instead of being who they truly are. And that constant performance creates anxiety because you can never relax. You can never simply be. You are always acting for approval. The modern trap is that culture trains you to base your worth on external metrics, social media followers, income compared to others, professional titles, physical appearance measured by external standards. Each of these places your identity outside your control, and as long as your identity is outside your control, you will live anxious about losing it. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific to keep his identity internal and independent of external opinions. Each night he asked himself, "Did I act today according to my principles? Was I the person I chose to be?" Not, "What did others think of me?" Not, "Was I admired?" But, "Was I who I decided to be, according to my values?" If the answer was yes, the day was successful regardless of others' opinions. If the answer was no, the day was a failure, no matter how much approval he received. That practice kept his identity entirely under his control. Epictetus taught his students something radical. When you enter a room, do not concern yourself with what others think of you. Concern yourself with whether you are being who you have decided to be. The shift is absolute. From, "Will they approve of me?" to, "Am I acting with integrity?" From, "Will they think well of me?" to, "Am I living according to my values?" The first creates anxiety because you do not control others' opinions. The second creates peace because you fully control your actions. The practice that frees your identity from external approval is uncomfortable but transformative. For 2 weeks, every time you feel social anxiety or anxiety about your worth, ask yourself, "Am I anxious because I am not being who I want to be, or because I fear others will not approve of me?" The honest answer is almost always the second. You are not anxious because you failed your values. You are anxious because you fear disapproval. Then ask the critical second question. What matters more, living according to my values or being approved by others? If you choose the first and live it consistently, anxiety about approval dissolves. Not because everyone approves of you, but because you no longer need their approval to know who you are. Seneca ended one of his texts with a devastating question. Will you live your life trying to satisfy the shifting expectations of 1,000 different people, or will you live according to your own constant principles? The first guarantees perpetual anxiety because expectations are endless and impossible to satisfy. The second creates deep peace because your worth is entirely under your control. In the end, the fourth reason for your anxiety is clear. You have placed your identity and your value in the hands of others, and now you live in constant fear of losing their approval because you believe losing it means losing yourself. But that is false. Your identity is not in their opinions. It is in your actions, aligned with your values. And when you base your identity there on what you actually control, anxiety about approval disappears completely. Not because everyone approves of you, but because their approval no longer defines who you are. Fifth Stoic reason: you resist what is already happening. There is a form of anxiety that is completely self-imposed and completely unnecessary. It is the anxiety that comes from resisting what is already reality. Something already happened. Something is already happening. Something is already true, and your mind refuses to accept it. This shouldn't have happened. This can't be happening. It isn't fair that this is how things are. And while your mind fights reality, your body lives in a constant state of tension. Because you are at war with what is, and that war is impossible to win. Reality does not change because you resist it. You only remain in suffering while the resistance continues. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that exposes this madness perfectly. Accept what happens and flow with it. This is the shortest path to peace. Resisting what already is changes nothing except your own suffering. He was not talking about passive resignation. He was not saying, do nothing to change difficult situations. He was pointing to something deeper. Before you can change anything effectively, you must first accept that it exists. Mental resistance to what is already happening is not productive action. It is unproductive suffering. Epictetus taught this with brutally practical examples. If it rains, what good does it do to be angry that it rains? The rain will continue regardless of your anger. You have only added your anger to the fact of the rain. It sounds simple. It sounds obvious when it's about rain. But you do the exact same thing with far more important situations. Someone rejected you. It already happened. It is reality. But you spend days mentally resisting that rejection. It shouldn't have happened. It isn't fair. It should have been different. That resistance does not undo the rejection. It only adds suffering to the fact of rejection. You lost your job. It already happened. It is reality. But your mind fights it. I shouldn't have lost it. I deserve to keep it. That resistance does not bring the job back. It only traps your mind in an impossible battle against what is already true. Your relationship ended. It already happened. It is reality. But you resist accepting it. It shouldn't have ended. It could still work. It can't be over. That resistance does not revive the relationship. It only keeps you stuck in denial that produces constant anxiety. Seneca observed people wasting entire years resisting realities they could not change. They spend more energy lamenting what happened than would be required to adapt to what is. Resistance feels like action. It feels as if your refusal to accept means you still have control, but it is the opposite. Resistance to what already is keeps you trapped. Acceptance of what is frees you to respond effectively. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific whenever he faced unpleasant realities. He immediately asked himself, has this already happened, or is it happening now? If yes, he asked the second critical question. Will mentally resisting this change the fact that it already happened? The answer was always no. So he consciously chose acceptance instead of resistance. Not, I like this. Not, this is good. But, this is real. This already is. My resistance does not change it. My acceptance allows me to respond from clarity instead of denial. That practice instantly transformed his relationship with difficult events. From, why is this happening to me? To, this is happening, how do I respond wisely? The difference is not semantic. It is the difference between being trapped in anxiety over what already happened and being free to act on what comes next. Epictetus taught his students something that sounds harsh, but is deeply liberating. Do not say, this should not have happened. Say, this happened. Now I choose how to respond. The first thought keeps you at war with reality. The second frees you to work with reality. The trap is that resistance disguises itself as virtue. If I don't resist this, it means I accept it as right. If I don't fight this mentally, it means I gave up. If I don't complain about this, it means it was okay that it happened. That is complete confusion. Accepting that something is real is not the same as approving it morally. You can fully accept that something unjust happened, and from that acceptance, work to correct the injustice. You can fully acknowledge that something terrible is happening, and from that acknowledgement, act to improve it. But as long as you are mentally resisting the fact that it already happened, your energy is trapped in an internal battle instead of external, effective action. Seneca wrote something specific about people who resisted their own aging. They waste all their energy lamenting that they are growing old, as if their resistance could stop time. Meanwhile, the years they have left pass unlived because they are too busy resisting the passage of time. Apply that to any reality you are resisting. Your resistance does not change reality. It only consumes the time and energy you could use to respond wisely to that reality. The practice that dissolves this pattern of anxiety is uncomfortable because it exposes how much energy you spend in useless resistance. For 1 week, every time you feel anxiety or tension, ask yourself, am I resisting something that is already reality? Not, do I like this reality? But am I mentally fighting something that is already true? The honest answer is often yes. Then ask the second question, does my resistance change this reality, or does it only add suffering to the fact that it exists? And finally, consciously choose, I accept that this is real. I do not like it, but it is real. Now I choose how to respond from clarity instead of resistance. Marcus Aurelius practiced this specifically with events he could not control. Devastating plagues, endless wars, betrayals by people close to him. He could have spent years mentally resisting. There shouldn't be a plague. It isn't fair that there is war. People shouldn't betray. But that resistance would not have stopped the plague, ended the war, or prevented betrayal. It would only have added his mental suffering to the external suffering. Instead, he practiced immediate acceptance of what was not because he liked it, but because acceptance freed him to act effectively. There is a plague. That is real. How do I respond? There is war. That is real. How do I lead? There was betrayal. That is real. How do I proceed? Acceptance was not passivity. It was the prerequisite for effective action. Epictetus warned specifically against confusing acceptance with approval. Accept what you cannot change, not because it is right, but because it is. Then work to change what you can from clarity instead of resistance. In the end, the fifth reason for your anxiety is clear. You spend massive energy mentally resisting what is already reality. And that resistance changes nothing except your level of suffering. As long as you keep fighting what already happened, what already is, you will live in constant tension. Not because reality is difficult, but because you are at war with reality. The Stoic alternative is not to love everything that happens. It is to accept what is as the starting point, and from that acceptance, act wisely. That practice transforms unproductive anxiety into effective action. Sixth Stoic reason. You believe your thoughts are reality. There is a form of anxiety that is completely self-imposed through a fundamental confusion. You confuse your thoughts with reality. Your mind generates a thought. I'll probably fail at this. And you don't treat it as a thought. You treat it as a fact. You don't think, my mind generated the thought of possible failure. You think, I'm going to fail. And your body reacts to the second as if it were confirmed truth. Anxiety does not come from the real possibility of failure. It comes from treating the thought of failure as if it were present reality. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that should completely free you. The things that disturb your mind have no inherent power to disturb you. They only have the power you give them by believing them. Your thoughts are not reality. They are interpretations, projections, narratives your mind constantly produces, and most of them are wrong. But when you believe your thoughts are reality, you become enslaved to every anxious thought your mind generates. And your mind generates dozens of anxious thoughts every hour. I'm not good enough. They'll probably reject me. Something bad is going to happen. I can't handle this. Everything will go wrong. If you treat each of those thoughts as truth, you will live in constant anxiety, because your mind has an evolutionary negativity bias. It is designed to anticipate danger, because that kept your ancestors alive. But you now live in a world where most of the threats your mind generates are imaginary. And if you believe every anxious thought your mind produces, you will live terrified of dangers that do not exist. Epictetus taught something radical about your relationship with your own thoughts. When a disturbing impression appears, immediately say to it, "You are only an impression, not necessarily what you appear to be." Then examine it according to your principles, not, "This thought is true and I must act on it," but, "This is a thought. It may be true or it may be false. I must examine it before believing it." That simple distinction completely transforms your relationship with anxiety. Because most anxious thoughts, when examined honestly, reveal themselves as speculation without evidence. "I'll probably fail" becomes, "My mind is anticipating one possible negative outcome among many possible outcomes." "I can't handle this" becomes, "My mind is underestimating my capacity based on fear, not on real evidence from my past." "Everything will go wrong" becomes, "My mind is catastrophizing, projecting the worst possible scenario out of countless possible scenarios." When you see anxious thoughts for what they are, automatic mental productions, not absolute truths, they lose their power over you. Seneca observed this constantly. People completely controlled by thoughts they never questioned. They suffer because they believe every thought their mind generates. They do not realize that the mind lies constantly, especially when it is anxious. An anxious mind is the least reliable narrator possible. It exaggerates danger. It minimizes your resources. It catastrophizes possibilities. It ignores positive evidence. It amplifies negative evidence. And if you believe everything that anxious mind tells you, you will live in an imaginary world of terror. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific when anxious thoughts arose. He did not suppress them. He did not fight them. He observed them and questioned them. "This is a thought. Is it true? Do I have real evidence that this is true, or is it anxious speculation? This thought says I'll fail. Have I always failed in similar situations, or is my mind generalizing from selective cases? This thought says, I can't handle this. What real evidence do I have? Have I handled difficult things before? Why would this be different? That questioning was not fighting the thought. It was simply refusing to believe it automatically. And when you stop automatically believing anxious thoughts, you discover that most of them are false. The practice that transforms your relationship with anxious thoughts is simple, but it requires constant vigilance. For 2 weeks, every time you notice an anxious thought, do 3 things. First, identify it as a thought, not as reality. Literally say, my mind is generating the thought that X. Okay, not X is true, but my mind is thinking X. That distinction creates critical distance between you and the thought. Second, question its validity. Do I have real evidence that this thought is true, or is it anxious speculation? You do not need to prove it false. You only need to recognize whether you lack evidence that it is true. Third, generate an alternative interpretation based on evidence. If the thought is, I'll fail, the alternative is, I don't know the outcome. I've succeeded in similar situations before. Failure is possible, but it is not certain. If the thought is, I can't handle this, the alternative is, this is difficult. I've handled difficult things before. I have no evidence that this time is different. Epictetus taught specifically, when a disturbing thought appears, do not accept it immediately. Examine it, question it, and only then decide whether it deserves to influence your state of mind. This practice does not eliminate anxious thoughts. Your mind will continue to generate them because that is how it is designed, but it completely transforms your relationship with them from, my thoughts control my emotional state, to, I observe my thoughts and choose which ones to believe based on evidence. Seneca closed one of his writings with a critical warning. Most people suffer far more in their minds than they suffer in reality. They believe every anxious thought that appears without questioning whether it is true, and that imaginary suffering is completely unnecessary. Because when you honestly examine your anxious thoughts, you discover that most of them are unfounded speculation. In the end, the sixth reason for your anxiety is clear. You treat your thoughts as if they were reality. And because your mind generates dozens of anxious thoughts every hour, you live in constant fear of threats that exist only in your mind. The Stoic alternative is not to suppress thoughts. It is to observe them, question them, and believe only those that have real evidence. That practice transforms thoughts from masters that control you into mental events you observe without automatically believing. And that transformation removes most of your anxiety at its root. Seventh Stoic reason: you have built expectations that reality cannot fulfill. There is a form of anxiety that is completely self-imposed through inflated expectations. You expect life to be fair. You expect people to act reasonably. You expect effort to guarantee results. You expect the world to operate according to your preferences. And when reality inevitably violates those expectations, you generate massive anxiety, not because reality is the problem, but because your expectations were unrealistic from the start. Marcus Aurelius wrote something brutally honest about this. When you wake up in the morning, remind yourself that you will meet difficult people, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, envious, antisocial people. Do not be surprised when they appear. In fact, expect them. He was not being pessimistic. He was being realistic. People are imperfect. Life is unjust. The world does not operate according to your preferences. And when you expect that instead of the opposite, reality does not strike you with anxious surprise when it happens. Epictetus taught something similar, but even more directly. Do not seek for events to happen as you wish. Instead, wish for events to happen as they do happen, and you will be well. That sounds like resignation, but it is the exact opposite. It is the recognition that your expectations about how life should be generate most of your suffering, because life will never be how it should be according to your expectations. It will be how it is. And if your well-being depends on life meeting your expectations, you will live in constant disappointment and anxiety. Anxiety comes from the gap between expectation and reality. When you expect something to be a certain way and it turns out differently, that gap produces anxiety, frustration, and disappointment. And the larger the gap, the greater the anxiety. Seneca observed this constantly in people who built massive expectations. They expect their business to always grow. They expect their health to never fail. They expect their relationships to always be harmonious. And when any of these expectations are violated, they collapse into anxiety because reality did not fulfill their fantasy. The trap is that modern culture trains you to build inflated expectations. You deserve to be happy all the time. You deserve for things to go your way. You deserve for life to be easy. Each of these expectations guarantees anxiety when reality fails to deliver. And reality will always fail to deliver because life includes suffering, difficulty, injustice, and events beyond your control. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific to keep his expectations realistic. Before any important event, he asked himself, "What is the worst that could happen? And could I handle that?" Not anxious, catastrophizing, realistic mental preparation. If the worst-case scenario was manageable, then any outcome was manageable. And that preparation eliminated the anxiety created by rigid expectations about how things must turn out. Epictetus taught his students a similar exercise. Before going anywhere, imagine that you will encounter obstacles, difficult people, and imperfect situations, not as pessimism, but as realistic preparation. When you expect imperfection and imperfection arrives, there is no anxious shock. You expected imperfection. Imperfection arrived. Your expectation was fulfilled. But when you expect perfection and imperfection arrives, the gap creates massive anxiety. The practice that dismantles this pattern of anxiety is uncomfortable because it exposes how many unrealistic expectations you carry. For 1 week, every time you feel anxiety, frustration, or disappointment, ask yourself, what expectation did I have that was not met? Be specific, not, I expected things to go well, but I expected that person to act a certain way, or I expected this event to turn out exactly as I planned, or I expected life to be fair in this situation. Then ask the second critical question. Was this expectation realistic based on how the world actually works? The honest answer is often no. You expected total control over variables you do not control. You expected people to behave rationally when people often behave irrationally. You expected the world to be fair when the world is frequently unjust. Each of these unrealistic expectations guaranteed anxiety when reality violated them. Seneca practiced something additional: specific negative visualization. Before any important event, he vividly imagined things going wrong. Not as masochism, as preparation. What if I lose all my wealth? I will survive. I have lived with less before. What if this relationship ends? I will be sad, but I will recover. I have survived loss before. What if this project fails? I will learn and begin another. That visualization did not create anxiety. It prevented it, because it removed rigid expectations that things must go perfectly. And when you recognize that you could handle even the worst-case scenario, you stop living anxiously trying to protect the best-case scenario. Marcus Aurelius summarized this perfectly. The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts, but it also depends on the reasonableness of your expectations. High-quality thinking, combined with unrealistic expectations, still produces suffering, because reality will constantly violate unrealistic expectations, no matter how well you think. In the end, the seventh reason for your anxiety is clear. You have built expectations about how life should be that life will never fulfill. And every time reality violates those expectations, you generate anxiety from the gap between what you expected and what is. The Stoic alternative is not to have no expectations. It is to have realistic expectations based on how the world actually works, not on how you wish it worked. That practice transforms expectations from constant sources of anxiety into realistic preparation that makes you capable of handling any outcome. Eighth Stoic reason. You do not distinguish between real fear and imaginary fear. Your mind generates fear constantly. But there are two completely different kinds of fear, and confusing them creates massive, unnecessary anxiety. Real fear. There is a present and specific threat that requires immediate action. A car is speeding toward you. An aggressive dog attacks. A building is on fire. That fear is useful. It activates you to respond to present danger. Imaginary fear. Your mind projects possible future threats that do not exist now. What if I lose my job? What if they reject me? What if I fail? What if something terrible happens? That fear is completely useless. There is no present threat. There is only anxious speculation about possible futures, and your body does not distinguish between the two. When your mind generates imaginary fear about losing your job, your body reacts as if you were in immediate danger. Your heart races, your breathing tightens, your nervous system shifts into emergency mode, all for a threat that exists only in your imagination. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that exposes this confusion perfectly. When something frightens you, ask yourself, is there danger here and now? Almost always the answer is no. There is only the imagination of future danger, and imagination does not deserve the same response as real danger. Not ignore the future, but distinguish between useful preparation for the future and useless suffering about the future. When there is present danger, act immediately. That is the purpose of real fear. When there is only imagined future danger, recognize it as such. It does not deserve to activate your emergency system. Epictetus taught something precise about this distinction. Most of the fear you feel is not about what is happening, but about what you fear might happen. And 99% of what you fear never happens. Think about the last month. How many fears did you have about things that might happen? Now count how many of those things actually happened. The ratio is usually devastating. You feared 100 things. 5 happened. The other 95 were completely unnecessary suffering over imaginary threats. Seneca observed this with brutal accuracy. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. And when what we feared finally arrives, we discover it is manageable, but we have already suffered 1,000 times anticipating it. That is the tragedy of imaginary fear. It does not only make you suffer for things that never happen. When something difficult actually does happen, you discover you can handle it, but you already wasted months or years suffering in advance. You suffered preventively for no benefit at all. The trap is that imaginary fear disguises itself as responsible preparation. I need to think about what could go wrong to be prepared. But anxious thinking about what could go wrong is not preparation, it is rumination. Preparation is present action, building skills, creating contingency plans, developing resources. Rumination is present suffering about imaginary futures without taking action. Marcus Aurelius practiced a specific question whenever fear arose. Is there a present danger that requires immediate action? If yes, he acted immediately. Fear fulfilled its function. If no, he recognized the fear as imaginary and refused to activate his emergency system. My mind is generating negative future scenarios. There is no present danger. I can plan wisely without suffering anxiously. That simple distinction transformed paralyzing fear into actionable clarity. Epictetus taught his students a blunt but effective exercise. When you feel fear, ask yourself, is this happening now? If not, it is imaginary. Treat it as such. Not it could happen. Not it will probably happen. But is it happening now? If it is not happening now, it is imagination. And imagination does not deserve the same response as present reality. The practice that dismantles this pattern of anxiety is simple, but it requires constant vigilance. For 2 weeks, every time you feel fear or anxiety, immediately ask, is there a present threat here and now that requires immediate action? Be brutally honest. Not, there could be danger later, but, is there danger now? If yes, act immediately. That is the purpose of fear. If no, say out loud, this is imaginary fear. My mind is projecting possible future threats. There is no present danger. That recognition does not instantly eliminate fear, but it creates critical distance between you and the fear. You are no longer someone in danger. You are someone whose mind is generating thoughts of possible danger. The difference is absolute. Seneca practiced something additional. When he identified imaginary fear, he immediately asked, what present action can I take that would actually prepare me for this possible future? Not, how can I worry more effectively? But what real action can I take now? Often he realized he had already done everything possible. Then further worry was completely useless. Other times he identified a specific action and did it immediately, and the fear disappeared because action had replaced rumination. But he never allowed imaginary fear to persist without either becoming real preparation or being discarded as useless. Marcus Aurelius summarized this perfectly. If a problem is solvable, why worry? Solve it. If it is not solvable, why worry? It will change nothing. In both cases, anxious worry is useless. Either there is action to take, then take it. Or there is no action to take, then let it go. But never remain in the middle state of suffering without action, which is exactly what imaginary fear creates. In the end, the 8th reason for your anxiety is clear. You do not distinguish between real fear that signals present danger and imaginary fear that merely projects possible dangers, and you treat both as if they deserve the same emergency response. So you live in a constant state of emergency for threats that exist only in your imagination. The Stoic alternative is not to eliminate all fear. It is to respond to real fear with immediate action and to recognize imaginary fear for what it is. Anxious speculation that does not deserve to activate your emergency system. That distinction transforms constant anxiety into effective preparation. 9th Stoic reason. You accumulate unmade decisions instead of acting. There is a form of anxiety that is entirely self-imposed through the procrastination of decisions. You have a decision to make, a conversation to have, an action to take, but you postpone it. I'll do it later, when I'm more ready. And while the decision remains unmade, your mind ruminates on it constantly. What should I do? What is the right option? What if I make the wrong choice? That rumination generates massive anxiety because your mind is processing the decision without reaching a conclusion. It is like having 100 tabs open in your mental browser. Each one consumes resources. All of them together exhaust you completely. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that exposes this madness perfectly. Act according to your best judgment, and do not torment yourself over the decision. Most suffering comes from prolonged indecision, not from the consequences of deciding. Not all your decisions will be perfect, but deciding and acting creates far less suffering than postponing indefinitely. Because when you decide and act, the rumination stops. That mental tab is closed. When you postpone deciding, the rumination continues indefinitely, and that rumination produces constant anxiety. Epictetus taught something precise about decisions. Use your best judgment. Decide. Act. If it turns out you were wrong, adjust. But never remain in indecision, because indecision guarantees suffering. The trap is that indecision disguises itself as being careful. I can't decide yet. I need more information. I need to be more certain. I need the circumstances to be clearer. But that is procrastination dressed up as prudence, because you will never have complete information. You will never be completely certain. Circumstances will never be perfectly clear. So, if you wait for those conditions, you will wait indefinitely while the anxiety of the unmade decision drains your mental energy. Seneca observed this in people paralyzed by decisions they postponed for years. They spend more mental energy agonizing over the decision than they would need to recover from a wrong decision. If you decide incorrectly, you can adjust. The cost is temporary. If you do not decide and remain in indecision, you pay the cost of anxiety every day with no progress at all. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific with difficult decisions. He gave himself a fixed deadline. I will decide this by the end of the week. Then he gathered information during that time. He consulted his judgment. He considered options. And when the deadline arrived, he decided according to his best judgment at that moment, even without complete certainty, because he understood that complete certainty would never arrive, and that prolonged indecision was more costly than a potentially imperfect decision. Epictetus taught his students something blunt. Perfection in decision-making is impossible. Prolonged indecision is intolerable, so decide imperfectly rather than never deciding perfectly. Not decide without thinking, but think, decide, act without waiting for impossible certainty. The anxiety you feel does not come from the difficult decisions you face. It comes from the decisions you have accumulated without making. Each postponed decision is an open tab in your mind, constantly consuming resources. And the more unmade decisions you accumulate, the more overwhelmed you feel, not because the decisions are harder, but because you are processing too many at once. The practice that dismantles this pattern of anxiety is uncomfortable because it reveals how many decisions you have been postponing. Today, make a list of all the decisions you have been avoiding. No justifications for why you haven't decided, just the list. Conversations you need to have, changes you need to make, actions you need to take, commitments you need to establish or end. Then, for each one, ask honestly, do I have enough information to decide according to my best current judgment? The honest answer is almost always yes. You do not have complete information, but you have enough to exercise reasonable judgment. Then set a specific deadline. I will decide this by X date, and when that date arrives, decide according to your best judgment at that moment. Do not wait to feel ready. Do not wait for complete certainty. Do not wait for the decision to feel obvious. Simply decide based on what you know now, recognizing that you might be wrong, and that if you are, you will adjust. Seneca practiced something additional. After deciding, he consciously let the decision go. I decided according to my best judgment. Now I will act on that decision without tormenting myself over whether it was correct. That practice fully closed the mental tab. The decision was made. The action was in motion. There was no benefit in continued rumination. Marcus Aurelius summarized this perfectly. Do every act of your life as if it were your last. Let go of passion. Stop letting emotion override reason. Abandon hypocrisy. Abandon self-pity. Stop complaining about your fate. It's placing var. And he could have added, stop postponing decisions you know you need to make, because every postponed decision is a source of anxiety you consume daily for no benefit at all. In the end, the ninth reason for your anxiety is clear. You accumulate unmade decisions while your mind constantly ruminates on them. And that rumination without resolution creates massive anxiety because you are processing everything at once without closing anything. The Stoic alternative is not impulsive decision-making. It is reasonable thinking, deciding according to your best judgment, acting and adjusting when necessary. That practice transforms decisions from perpetual sources of anxiety into actions you complete and move beyond. 10th Stoic reason. You fight against your mortal and imperfect nature. There is one final form of anxiety that is the deepest and the most universal. It is the anxiety that comes from resisting what you fundamentally are, a mortal and imperfect human being. You are afraid of making mistakes. You are afraid of not being good enough. You are afraid of aging. You are afraid of getting sick. You are afraid of dying. And all of these fears come from resisting your basic nature. You are imperfect. You will make mistakes. You will age. You will eventually get sick. You will die. These are not possibilities. They are certainties. And as long as you fight against these certainties, as long as you resist your mortal and imperfect nature, you will live in constant existential anxiety. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that should confront you brutally. You are a soul carrying a corpse. Remember this, and you will fear nothing. This was not morbidity. It was fundamental truth, the truth most people avoid. Your body has been dying since the moment you were born. Every day you are closer to the end. Imperfection is your natural state, not a defect. And when you fully accept that, when you stop fighting your mortal and imperfect nature, a deep peace becomes possible. Not because death is pleasant, but because you are no longer at war with the inevitable. Epictetus, who lived as a slave and faced mortality constantly, taught something liberating. Do not fear death. Fear the life not lived because of fear of death. Most people do not fear death directly. They fear what death represents: loss of control, the end of existence, the final proof of imperfection, and that fear contaminates their entire lives. They do not take risks because they might fail, and failure proves imperfection. They do not try because they might be rejected, and rejection proves insufficiency. They do not live fully because living fully requires accepting that everything is temporary, including themselves. So they live small, controlled, anxious lives, all in a futile attempt to deny their mortality and imperfection. Seneca observed this in the most powerful people in Rome. They possess all imaginable power, yet they live terrified because their power cannot stop aging, prevent illness, or avoid death. So they accumulate more power in a futile attempt to control the uncontrollable, their mortal nature, and that attempt generates massive anxiety because it is a battle they will inevitably lose. Marcus Aurelius practiced something most people would avoid: daily meditation on his mortality, not as morbidity, as recognition of reality. I will die, maybe today, maybe in 50 years, but I will die. My body will fail. My existence will end. This is absolute certainty. That recognition did not create anxiety. It eliminated it, because he stopped resisting the inevitable. And in that acceptance, he found freedom to live fully. If I am going to die anyway, what stops me from living according to my values today? What do I fear? If the worst possible outcome, death, is inevitable, no matter what I do. Epictetus taught his students something similar about imperfection. You are human. Humans make mistakes. If you expect not to make mistakes, you expect to be something you are not. And that impossible expectation creates perpetual suffering. The alternative is not accepting mediocrity. It is accepting that you will give your best imperfect effort, and that this is exactly what an imperfect human is meant to do. Not impossible perfection, but human excellence within human limitations. The practice that dismantles this final pattern of anxiety is the hardest and the most liberating. For 1 month, dedicate 5 minutes every morning to explicitly acknowledging, I am mortal, I will die. I do not know when, but I know it will happen. My body is temporary. My existence is limited. This is undeniable reality. Then ask yourself, if I fully accept my mortality, which current fear loses its power? Fear of failure loses power because everything is temporary anyway. Fear of rejection loses power because external approval is irrelevant when time is limited. Fear of making mistakes loses power because imperfection is your nature, not a flaw. Seneca practiced vividly visualizing his own death. I imagine my final day, my final hours, my final breath, and I ask myself, how do I want to have lived the days before that moment? That visualization did not generate fear, it generated clarity. Clarity about what truly mattered. Clarity about what was meaningless noise. Clarity about how to live each day as if it mattered because it does. Marcus Aurelius also practiced explicitly acknowledging his imperfection. I am imperfect. I make mistakes. My judgment is limited. My knowledge is incomplete. This is not an excuse not to act. It is recognition that I will act imperfectly, and that is acceptable. That recognition freed him from the paralysis of perfectionism. He no longer needed to be perfect to act. He could act imperfectly, which is the only way humans can act. In the end, the 10th reason for your anxiety is the deepest one. You are fighting against your mortal and imperfect nature. You are resisting what you fundamentally are, and that resistance generates existential anxiety that contaminates your entire life. The Stoic alternative is not defeated resignation. It is radical acceptance of your nature, mortal, imperfect, limited, temporary, and from that acceptance, complete freedom to live according to your values without fear, because you have already accepted the worst possible outcome. Seneca closed one of his final writings with words that summarize all of this. Begin living immediately. Every day postponed is a day lost forever. We lose our lives because we delay living until we are ready. But we will never be ready to live fully until we accept that we will inevitably die. That acceptance is not the end of a meaningful life. It is the beginning of the only life that is truly free, the awakening. When you finally understand that you generate your own anxiety, you have reached the end of these 10 reasons. But if you think that the end of these words means you are finished, then you have not understood anything. These reasons are not information to consume and forget the next time you feel anxious. They are mirrors that reflect, with devastating precision, how you generate your own anxiety through specific mental patterns. And if you have been honest while listening, you have probably seen patterns that are painful to recognize. You have seen how much energy you spend trying to control what cannot be controlled. You have seen how much time you live in imagined futures while the present passes unlived. You have seen how you turn preferences into absolute necessities. You have seen how your identity depends on approval you do not control. You have seen how you resist realities that do not change because of your resistance. You have seen how you believe every anxious thought without questioning it. You have seen how your unrealistic expectations constantly collide with reality. You have seen how you confuse real fear with imagined fear. You have seen how you accumulate decisions without acting while endlessly ruminating. You have seen how you fight against your mortal and imperfect nature. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that perfectly captures this moment. The mind adapts and turns obstacles into fuel. What stands in the way becomes the way. Everything these reasons have exposed about how you generate your anxiety, every mental pattern, every destructive habit, every way of thinking that produces suffering, is not evidence that you are broken. It is exactly the raw material from which freedom from anxiety is built. But only if you stop running from what you have seen and begin changing the patterns. There comes a moment in every person's life when they must make a definitive decision about their anxiety. Not a temporary decision made in moments of inspiration and forgotten when anxiety returns. A permanent decision that completely redefines how you relate to your mind. That decision is this: I stop believing that my anxiety comes from external circumstances. I recognize that I generate it through specific mental patterns that I can change. I will not allow my mind to operate without supervision. I will not automatically believe every anxious thought it produces. I will not resist realities I cannot change. I will not turn preferences into necessities. I will not live in imagined futures while ignoring the real present. I will take absolute control over the only thing I truly control, how my mind processes reality. Epictetus taught that there are only 2 kinds of people when it comes to anxiety: those controlled by their thoughts and those who observe their thoughts. The first believe everything their mind generates. The second question what their mind generates. The first live as victims of anxious thinking. The second live as observers of mental processes they can change. The difference is not having a different mind. It is relating to your mind in a different way. The transformation these reasons can create is neither magical nor instant. You will not hear this today and wake up tomorrow completely free of anxiety. But you can begin a process today that, sustained over months, will turn you into a completely different person in your relationship with anxiety. A person who does not automatically believe every anxious thought. A person who distinguishes between what they control and what they do not. A person who lives in the present instead of imagined futures. A person who accepts reality instead of uselessly resisting it. That process begins with one decision. Today, now, I choose to observe how I generate my anxiety instead of continuing to believe it comes from outside. Seneca practiced examining his mind with a devastatingly simple question. Am I anxious about something that is happening now, or about something I am imagining? The honest answer was almost always imagination. And that answer revealed that his anxiety was self-generated, not externally caused. That realization did not make it disappear instantly, but it made change possible. Because if you generate it, you can stop generating it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself specifically about anxiety. It is within the power of the mind to recognize what creates anxiety and to stop creating it. The power is not in suppressing anxiety. It is in seeing clearly how you produce it through specific mental patterns. And when you see clearly, you can change the patterns. Before fully closing, you need to do more than listen passively. You need to declare a specific commitment that goes beyond this moment of clarity. Go to the comments right now and write exactly this. My anxiety does not come from outside. From today on, I observe how I generate it from within. That public declaration is your line in the sand. It is the moment you stop being a victim of anxiety and become an observer of the mental processes that create it. Do it now. Pause. Go to the comments. Write, my anxiety does not come from outside. From today on, I observe how I generate it from within. The Stoics understood that publicly declaring intention dramatically multiplies your ability to follow through, because it creates accountability that private thought never does. Epictetus taught that change in anxiety is not abstract philosophy. It is daily, concrete practice. Tomorrow, when you feel anxiety, immediately ask yourself, which of the 10 reasons am I activating right now? Am I trying to control what I cannot control? Am I living in an imagined future? Have I turned a preference into a necessity? Am I seeking external approval to define my worth? Am I resisting a reality that already is? Am I believing thoughts without questioning them? Do I have unrealistic expectations? Am I treating imagined fear as real fear? Have I accumulated decisions without acting? Am I fighting my mortal nature? Identifying which reason you are activating gives you immediate clarity on how to stop generating that anxiety. Each reason is a practice of transformation. Seneca wrote in his final days, "It is not that we lack control over anxiety, it is that we do not exercise the control we have." Do not forget what these reasons showed you about how you generate your anxiety. Do not ignore the present moment you have right now to begin changing your mental patterns. Do not fear the work required to observe your mind consistently. Simply observe the next anxious thought with one question. How am I generating this? Then the next one. And the next. Marcus Aurelius never promised that changing your relationship with anxiety would be easy. He promised that it would be the only thing that truly works. that a life lived observing how you generate anxiety and choosing to stop generating it is the only life that produces lasting peace, not temporary suppression that fades, but deep clarity about how your mind works and conscious choice in how you use it. The path forward is simple, but not easy. Identify which of these 10 reasons confronted you the most. The one you recognized most clearly in yourself. The one that creates the most resistance when you think about changing it. That is exactly the one you must start with, because it points to your most active pattern. Commit to observing that pattern for 30 days, not all 10 at once. One reason, 30 days, consistent daily observation. After 30 days, that pattern will have lost power because you will have seen it clearly enough times. Then you add the second. Then the third. Epictetus warned, "How much longer will you live controlled by thoughts you never question?" That question applies now. How many more days will you live believing your anxiety comes from external circumstances you do not control? How many more weeks will you spend resisting realities that do not change because of resistance? How many more years will you waste trying to control the uncontrollable? You do not have unlimited time to decide to change. Every day you postpone is a day lived with unnecessary anxiety. Seneca faced his death having practiced these truths throughout his life. When his final day arrived, there was no paralyzing anxiety. There was absolute clarity, because he had observed his mind for decades. He had seen how it generated anxiety through specific patterns, and he had stopped operating under those patterns, not perfectly, but consistently. And that consistency gave him something few experience: a life without constant anxiety. That freedom is available to you. It does not require different circumstances. It does not require a different mind. It requires relating to your mind differently. It requires observing how you generate anxiety and choosing to stop generating it. Your anxiety has been your prison. But from today, if you choose to practice these truths, it can become your teacher. The thing that shows you exactly which mental patterns are active. The thing that points precisely to what you need to change. The thing that trains you to observe your mind instead of being controlled by it. The choice is entirely yours. But now it is a conscious choice. You can no longer pretend that your anxiety comes from circumstances you do not control. You know exactly how you generate it through 10 specific mental patterns. All that remains is deciding whether you will keep operating them or begin changing them. My anxiety does not come from outside. From today on, I observe how I generate it from within. That is not an inspirational phrase. It is a declaration of war against mental patterns that have consumed your peace for far too long. And if you declare that war and fight it in each anxious thought, you will win. Not magically, not easily, but inevitably and completely, because you are finally using the power you always had but never exercised. The power to observe your mind and choose how it operates. The anxiety you feel does not come from an uncertain future. It comes from how you process that future in your present mind. And when you change the processing, anxiety disappears without the future becoming any more certain. That change begins now, not when you feel ready, not when circumstances are better, now. With the anxiety you feel, with the patterns that are active, with the mind you have, the power was always within you. You only needed to see how you were using it to generate anxiety, so you could begin using it to generate peace. Your voice matters here more than you think. Every insight you share strengthens and elevates this community, because this isn't just another space. It's a circle of people who choose to live with intention, with discipline, and with character. Each of you leaves a mark, and the reflection that receives the most support will be pinned as a banner of who we are. Not as decoration, but as a reminder of the kind of warrior who chooses to think, feel, and act with stoic clarity. Because this is a community that doesn't run from pain, it walks through it with courage. A community that doesn't look for cheap comfort, it seeks wisdom. A community that doesn't break under adversity, it turns it into strength. And if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you is already shifting. Something is waking up. Something is asking for more. So, before you leave, check the description. There you'll find the paths we created to help you keep strengthening your mind. They're not there by accident. Each one exists to help you go deeper, build inner resilience, and return again and again to that place within you where nothing and no one can take your peace. Subscribing isn't doing the podcast a favor. It's an act of respect toward yourself. It's choosing not to live on autopilot anymore. It's committing to think differently, to feel with more order, to live with more intention. Because every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we publish reflections designed to stay with you when life gets heavy, when your mind gets loud, when you need a reminder of who you are. Not following us means risking missing the one lesson you might need in the hardest moment. And if you choose to go a step further, if you choose to become a member, understand one thing clearly. You're not donating, you're sustaining a mission. Because of you, this flame stays alive. Because of you, we can keep spreading Stoicism as a refuge for millions who are fighting not to give up. Your support is what keeps this podcast alive, strong, and growing. You're not a spectator, you're part of the foundation holding this community together. I'll see you in our next Stoicism for Winners session, where we'll keep exploring the depth of Stoic wisdom applied to everyday life. In the meantime, dive into the recommended sessions in the description and continue your path. And until we cross paths again, don't forget this. You are the master of your perception, the guardian of your peace, and the warrior of your own battle. That is the legacy of Stoicism. That is the art of becoming invincible.